Hello and welcome to Chapter 15.5, Effects of the Global Contact. So exploration in the 1500s and 1600s led the Europeans to dominate over the globe. But by the 1700s, worldwide contact brought major changes to the people in Europe and the Americas and Asia and Africa as well. When Columbus returned to Europe in 1493, he brought back American plants and animals, and later he carried European plants and animals and settlers back to the Americas. And this began a vast global interchange named the Columbian Exchange. So sharing different foodstuffs and livestock helped people around the world. The dispersal of these new crops from the Americas also contributed to worldwide population growth. Additionally, the Columbian Exchange started a migration to the Americas and the forcible transfer of millions of slaves, and it brought death to millions of Native Americans from European diseases. Another effect of the global contact was great economic change. So in the 1500s, the pace of inflation increased in Europe. It was fueled by the silver and gold that was flowing from the Americas. Inflation is basically the rise in prices linked to a sharp increase in the money supply. So this period of rapid inflation in Europe is known as the price revolution. And out of this came capitalism, an economic system of private business ownership. The key to capitalism was entrepreneurs, or people who take financial risks for profit. European entrepreneurs hired workers and paid production costs, joined investors in overseas ventures, and ultimately helped convert local economies into international trading economies. Fierce competition for trade and empires led to new economic system called mercantilism, which measured wealth by the nation's gold or silver supply. Mercantilists believe that nation must export more than it imports. They also pushed governments to impose tariffs on goods that were coming into the country. This gives an advantage to the local goods over the costlier imports. So economic changes took centuries to affect most of Europe. Most of Europe were still peasants in the 1700s, but many social changes had taken place. Nobles whose wealth was in land were really hurt by this price revolution. Merchants, on the other hand, who had invested in overseas ventures, grew very wealthy, and skilled workers in Europe were thriving. The thriving middle class started to develop. Okay, so the Columbian Exchange, which was initiated by Columbus, thus Columbian, is basically an exchange of plants and animals and diseases between the Old World, or Europe, and the New World, which was North and South America. And so this is a good picture to give you an example of things that were traded from Europe to North America. Horses being one of the big impacting animals that was introduced, because especially in North America, where there were a lot of tribes that were nomadic. Some of the vegetables and fruits that are surprising to many people are things like bananas and sugar cane, and those are the two main ones. Oh, and chickens. Those are the ones that surprised me when I was learning about this. So I always imagined that bananas were originally from South America, but that is not true. They were actually transplanted originally from Asia or Africa, and they were brought to the Americas with the settlers, the new European settlers. And sugar cane, surprisingly, is not from Central America. It is originally from Asia as well. And also coffee, which is grown largely in Central and South America now, is originally from Ethiopia. I should know, because that is a very favorite place of mine. Okay. And then going the other direction, some vegetables that probably saved many people's lives. One of the biggest ones is potatoes. With the potato basically fed millions of Europeans and kept them from starving to death, especially in places like Ireland. And later on, in the early 1800s, there is a I guess you could say, a blight that hits the potato crops in Ireland and causes whole crops of potatoes to rot in the ground. And this in turn makes the people of Ireland have to suffer through a great famine. And so lots and lots of people died because the potato crop failed, which tells you just how dependent on this crop the population was. So many of these new crops that were introduced to Europe from North and South America helped to save many people's lives and also to boost the population of Europe. So the global population started to explode in about 1700s, and one of the key causes was the spread of these new foods and crops from America. Native American population started to decline, though, severely, mainly because of European diseases. The commercial revolution that occurred during this time was a result of the exploration of North and South America. Prices began to rise in Europe because of the huge amount of silver and gold that was coming into the Americas, and this led to inflation. Some of the most lucrative silver mines in the world were actually located in Bolivia, in a place where I visited, by the way, but I didn't know that these had been some of the places where about 60% of the world's silver had been mined. But maybe one half of that went to Europe, and the other half went to China. China was one of the world's largest consumers of silver during this time period, mainly because China's own paper currency had been inflated to such an extent that it was basically useless, and so most merchants in China wouldn't accept any paper money, and gold was too valuable to exchange in daily interactions. So silver was the main currency in China, and it also was used in Europe as well. So this inflation is also known as a price revolution. And this means that the prices began to rise dramatically because of the value of money was going down. And so in order to get a profit, merchants would raise the price. So this became known as the price revolution, which led to a growth in what we call capitalism. And capitalism is basically a system of economy where the middle class has a lot of power, because they are able to use their wealth and reinvest it as capital to create more money. So money working for you. That's kind of the concept. So how would they get this to happen? How would the middle class use money to work for them? Mainly, they would use it there were several different ways. Number one, you could loan it to someone for an interest, which was called usury in the Middle Ages and was forbidden by the Catholic Church. But by this point in time, it had stopped to be forbidden, and so now lots of people were committing usury, I guess you could say. But the capital was used to help build businesses that were privately owned, they were not government owned or monopolies granted by the government, but they were private business people working. And these rich businessmen would often get together and form a joint stock company, which is basically they would buy a share in a company that would then send ships out to trade with the rest of the world. And it spread the risk of sending out ships and possibly having them sink or be attacked by pirates or have the venture fail in some way. And instead of one person losing all of that money that they had invested in that ship, it would be a group of men who lost only the investment that they had made. The fact that they were investing in a company and they only owned a share of that company protected their other assets so that they could not be penalized by having their other goods taken away from them. So it was great for the middle class people who had the money, but not for the nobility or the upper class, because many of the European upper class, the reason why they were part of the upper class was because they owned land. And during this time period, the value of land began to go down. Also, the very, very poor were not benefiting from this commercial revolution. And that was because they didn't have any capital to invest. So they were having to depend completely on their labor, which was being competed against other people because the population in Europe was going up during this time period. But the middle class were also learning skills to help them become better businessmen. One was bookkeeping, which today we take for granted, but it was a new concept adopted from the Arabs, and it helped them to keep more accurate records of their transactions and to see where the money was going and how they could get a profit. Banks also became more common, and this was mainly to help rich businessmen be able to loan out their money for a profit as well. Previously, during the Middle Ages, the goods were developed or made with guilds. People who were a member of a guild would be a craftsman, and so that guild would stipulate all the different details of how that thing was going to be made, how much it was going to be sold for, etc. Well, that's very cramping. It keeps people poor. It keeps people down. And so during this time period, merchants and entrepreneurs got the idea of using capital to help produce goods by using that money to buy stuff, buy the materials that they would need to make the product, giving those materials to a laborer who would then work and make that thing in their home, and then buying that product back from the laborer for a very reduced rate, and then the merchant would then be able to sell it to another place for a much higher profit. So the initial cost of buying the goods or the resources in order to make the final product, and basically paying for the labor up front, that was an investment. They were entrepreneurs, and and in return got the product made by the person who was at home. And this is what we call a cottage industry. The person who is living at home and working at home is producing goods with their very simple machines. Usually it was something like textiles, which are the production of cloth. And then they would take that finished product, the cloth, and sell it back to the merchant, the middleman. Well, of course, if you know anything about government, they cannot leave a good thing like that alone. Of course, they want to have a little bit of that profit as well. And so European monarchs began to adopt a new economic policy called mercantilism, which basically the goal of mercantilism policy is to build up the nation's wealth, which is gold and silver reserves. Well, in their minds, gold and silver were the only forms of wealth that you could count in this system. And so anything that is produced at home, it's better for them to either consume it within the nation itself or to sell it to their colonies. And in return, the colonies, their whole purpose is to benefit the mother country. So they would give all of their natural resources only to the mother country and not sell them to other countries, because that would be letting some of the wealth get away. So they didn't want to do that. And they also didn't want to allow cheap manufactured goods to be imported into their own country and then be in competition with their own manufactured goods. So the governments would put a tariff on goods that are being imported to the country. A tariff is just basically a tax on imports, and part of the reason for that tax is to raise the price of the product so that local goods are less expensive than imported goods. And this is just to help boost the national economy. Well, these tariffs help to try to protect the money that would have flowed out of the country if people had bought these imported goods. As a result of these measures, national governments had a lot of control over their economies. In the end, though, the people who got the pooey end of the stick were the poor, because the majority of Europeans were not experiencing any of these benefits from the Columbian, they were experiencing Columbian exchange, but they weren't experiencing any of the benefits of mercantilism or capitalism, because they didn't have the capital to be participants in the capitalistic economy. And so they lived like the Middle Ages to some extent until much, much later, after a few centuries of after the age of exploration. So the middle class families had a comfortable life, and there was a growing middle class, and the upper classes were starting to deteriorate. Their wealth base was starting to deteriorate. So the price revolution helped to enrich merchants and skilled workers, but it hurt the nobles, whose wealth was tied to land, and it hurt the very, very poor.